Mindfulness. It is always now. This might sound trite, but it's the truth. It's not quite true as a matter of neurology, because our minds are built upon layers of inputs whose timing we know must be different. But it's true as a matter of conscious experience. The reality of your life is always now, and to realize this, we will see, is liberating. In fact, I think there's nothing more important to understand if you want to be happy in this world. But we spend most of our lives forgetting this truth, overlooking it, fleeing it, repudiating it. And the horror is that we succeed. We manage to avoid being happy while struggling to become happy, fulfilling one desire after the next, banishing our fears, grasping at pleasure, recoiling from pain, and thinking interminably about how best to keep the whole works up and running. As a consequence, we spend our lives being far less content than we might otherwise be. We often fail to appreciate what we have until we have lost it. We crave experiences, objects, relationships, only to grow bored with them. And yet the craving persists. I speak from experience, of course. As a remedy for this predicament, many spiritual teachings ask us to entertain unfounded ideas about the nature of reality, or at the very least to develop a fondness for the iconography and rituals of one or another religion. But not all paths traverse the same rough ground. There are methods of meditation that do not require any artifice or unwarranted assumptions at all. For beginners, I usually recommend a technique called Vipassana, Pali for insight, which comes from the oldest tradition of Buddhism, the Theravada. One of the advantages of Vipassana is that it can be taught in an entirely secular way. Experts in this practice generally acquire their training in a Buddhist context, and most retreat centers in the United States and Europe teach its associated Buddhist philosophy. Nevertheless, this method of introspection can be brought within any secular or scientific context without embarrassment. The same cannot be said for the practice of chanting to Lord Krishna while banging a drum. That is why Vipassana is now being widely studied and adopted by psychologists and neuroscientists. The quality of mind cultivated in Vipassana is almost always referred to as mindfulness, and the literature on its psychological benefits is now substantial. There's nothing spooky about mindfulness. It is simply a state of clear, non-judgmental, and undistracted attention to the contents of consciousness, whether pleasant or unpleasant. Cultivating this quality of mind has been shown to reduce pain, anxiety, and depression, improve cognitive function, and even produce changes in gray matter density in regions of the brain related to learning and memory, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. We will look more closely at the neurophysiology of mindfulness in a later chapter. Mindfulness is a translation of the Pali word sati. The term has several meanings in the Buddhist literature, but for our purposes the most important is clear awareness. The practice was first described in the Satipatthana Sutta, which is part of the Pali Canon. Like many Buddhist texts, the Satipatthana Sutta is highly repetitive, and for anything but an avid student of Buddhism, exceptionally boring to read. However, when one compares texts of this kind with the Bible or the Quran, the difference is unmistakable. The Satipatthana Sutta is not a collection of ancient myths, superstitions, and taboos. It is a rigorously empirical guide to freeing the mind from suffering. The Buddha described 4 foundations of mindfulness, which he taught as, quote, the direct path for the purification of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of pain and grief, for the attainment of the true way, for the realization of nibbana. The Sanskrit word is nirvana. The 4 foundations of mindfulness are the body, breathing, changes in posture and activities; feelings, the senses of pleasantness and unpleasantness and neutrality; the mind, in particular its moods and attitudes; and the objects of mind, which include the 5 senses but also other mental states, such as volition, tranquility, rapture, equanimity, and even mindfulness itself. It is a peculiar list, at once redundant and incomplete, a problem that is compounded by the necessity of translating Pali terminology into English. The obvious message of the text, however, is that the totality of one's experience can become the field of contemplation. The meditator is merely instructed to pay attention, quote, ardently and fully aware, and free from covetousness and grief for the world. There is nothing passive about mindfulness. One might even say that it expresses a specific kind of passion, a passion for discerning what is subjectively real in every moment. It is a mode of cognition that is, above all, undistracted, accepting, and ultimately non-conceptual. Being mindful is not a matter of thinking more clearly about experience. It is the act of experiencing more clearly, including the arising of thoughts themselves. Mindfulness is a vivid awareness of whatever is appearing in one's mind or body, thoughts, sensations, moods, without grasping at the pleasant or recoiling from the unpleasant. One of the great strengths of this technique of meditation, from a secular point of view, is that it does not require us to adopt any cultural affectations or unjustified beliefs. It simply demands that we pay close attention to the flow of our experience in each moment. The principal enemy of mindfulness or any meditative practice is our deeply conditioned habit of being distracted by thoughts. The problem is not thoughts themselves, but the state of thinking without knowing that we are thinking. In fact, thoughts of all kinds can be perfectly good objects of mindfulness. In the early stages of one's practice, however, the arising of thought will be more or less synonymous with distraction, that is, with a failure to meditate. Most people who believe they are meditating are merely thinking with their eyes closed. By practicing mindfulness, however, one can awaken from the dream of discursive thought and begin to see each arising image, idea, or bit of language vanish without a trace. What remains is consciousness itself, with its attendant sights, sounds, sensations, and thoughts, appearing and changing in every moment. In the beginning of one's meditation practice, the difference between ordinary experience and what one comes to consider mindfulness is not very clear, and it takes some training to distinguish between being lost in thought and seeing thoughts for what they are. In this sense, learning to meditate is just like acquiring any other skill. It takes many thousands of repetitions to throw a good jab or to coax music from the strings of a guitar. With practice, mindfulness becomes a well-formed habit of attention, and the difference between it and ordinary thinking will become increasingly clear. Eventually, it begins to seem as if you are repeatedly awakening from a dream to find yourself safely in bed. No matter how terrible the dream, the relief is instantaneous. And yet it is difficult to stay awake for more than a few seconds at a time. My friend Joseph Goldstein, one of the finest Vipassana teachers I know, likens this shift in awareness to the experience of being fully immersed in a film, and then suddenly realizing that you're sitting in a theater watching a mere play of light on a wall. Your perception is unchanged, but the spell is broken. Most of us spend every waking moment lost in the movie of our lives. Until we see that an alternative to this enchantment exists, we are entirely at the mercy of appearances. Again, the difference I'm describing is not a matter of achieving a new conceptual understanding or of adopting new beliefs about the nature of reality. The change comes when we experience the present moment prior to the arising of thought. The Buddha taught mindfulness as the appropriate response to the truth of dukkha, usually translated from the Pali, somewhat misleadingly, as suffering. A better translation would be unsatisfactoriness. Suffering may not be inherent in life, but unsatisfactoriness is. We crave lasting happiness in the midst of change. Our bodies age, cherished objects break, pleasures fade, relationships fail. Our attachment to the good things in life and our aversion to the bad amount to a denial of these realities, and this inevitably leads to feelings of dissatisfaction. Mindfulness is a technique for achieving equanimity amid the flux, allowing us to simply be aware of the quality of experience in each moment, whether pleasant or unpleasant. This may seem like a recipe for apathy, but it needn't be. It is actually possible to be mindful and therefore to be at peace in the present moment, even while working to change the world for the better. Mindfulness meditation is extraordinarily simple to describe, but it isn't easy to perform. True mastery might require special talent and a lifetime of devotion to the task, and yet a genuine transformation of one's perception of the world is within reach for most of us. Practice is the only thing that will lead to success. The simple instructions given here are analogous to instructions on how to walk a tightrope, which I assume must go something like this. 1. Find a horizontal cable that can support your weight. 2. Stand on one end. 3. Step forward by placing one foot directly in front of the other. 4. Repeat. 5. Don't fall. Clearly, steps 2 through 5 entail a little trial and error. Happily, the benefits of training in meditation arrive long before mastery does, and falling, for our purposes, occurs almost ceaselessly, every time we become lost in thought. Again, the problem is not thoughts themselves, but the state of thinking without being fully aware that we are thinking. As every meditator soon discovers, distraction is the normal condition of our minds. Most of us topple from the wire every second, whether gliding happily into reverie or plunging into fear, anger, self-hatred, or other negative states of mind. Meditation is a technique for waking up. The goal is to come out of the trance of discursive thinking and to stop reflexively grasping at the pleasant and recoiling from the unpleasant, so that we can enjoy a mind undisturbed by worry, merely open like the sky, and effortlessly aware of the flow of experience in the present. How to meditate. Sit comfortably with your spine erect, either in a chair or cross-legged on a cushion. Close your eyes and take a few deep breaths, and feel the points of contact between your body and the chair or the floor. Notice the sensations associated with sitting. Feelings of pressure, warmth, tingling, vibration. Now gradually become aware of the process of breathing. Pay attention to wherever you feel the breath most distinctly, either at your nostrils or in the rising and falling of your abdomen. Allow your attention to rest in the mere sensation of breathing. You don't have to control your breath. Just let it come and go naturally. Every time your mind wanders into thought, just gently return it to the breath. And as you focus on the process of breathing, you'll also perceive sounds and bodily sensations or emotions. Simply observe these phenomena as they appear in consciousness, and then return to the breath. And the moment you notice that you've been lost in thought, observe the present thought itself as an object of consciousness. Watch what happens to it. And then return your attention to the breath or to any sounds or sensations arising in the next moment. Continue in this way until you can merely witness all objects of consciousness, sights, sounds, sensations, emotions, even thoughts themselves, as they arise and change and pass away. Those who are new to this practice generally find it useful to hear instructions of this kind spoken aloud during the course of a meditation session. I have posted guided meditations of varying length on my website. The truth of suffering. I'm sitting in a coffee shop in Midtown Manhattan, drinking exactly what I want, coffee, eating exactly what I want, a cookie, and doing exactly what I want, writing this book. It's a beautiful day, and many of the people passing by on the sidewalk appear to radiate good fortune from their pores. Several are so physically attractive that I'm beginning to wonder whether Photoshop can now be applied to the human body. Up and down this street, and for a mile in each direction, stores sell jewelry, art, and clothing that not even 1% of humanity could hope to purchase. So what did the Buddha mean when he spoke of the unsatisfactoriness, dukkha? Was he referring merely to the poor and the hungry? Or are these rich and beautiful people suffering even now? Of course, suffering is all around us, even here, where everything appears to be going well for the moment. First, the obvious. Within a few blocks of where I'm sitting are hospitals, convalescent homes, psychiatrists' offices, and other rooms built to assuage or merely to contain some of the most profound forms of human misery. A man runs over his own child while backing his car out of the driveway. A woman learns that she has terminal cancer on the eve of her wedding. We know that the worst can happen to anyone at any time, and most people spend a great deal of mental energy hoping that it won't happen to them. But more subtle forms of suffering can be found even among people who seem to have every reason to be satisfied in the present. Although wealth and fame can secure many forms of pleasure, few of us have any illusions that they guarantee happiness. Anyone who owns a television or reads the newspaper has seen movie stars, politicians, professional athletes, and other celebrities ricochet from marriage to marriage and from scandal to scandal. To learn that a young, attractive, talented, and successful person is nevertheless addicted to drugs or clinically depressed is to be given almost no cause for surprise. And yet the unsatisfactoriness of the good life runs deeper than this. Even while living safely between emergencies, most of us feel a wide range of painful emotions on a daily basis. When you wake up in the morning, are you filled with joy? How do you feel at work or when looking in the mirror? How satisfied are you with what you've accomplished in life? How much of your time with your family is spent surrendered to love and gratitude, and how much is spent just struggling to be happy in one another's company? Even for extraordinarily lucky people, life is difficult. And when we look at what makes it so, we see that we are all prisoners of our thoughts. And then there is death, which defeats everyone. Most people seem to believe that we have only two ways to think about death. We can fear it and do our best to ignore it, or we can deny that it is real. The first strategy leads to a life of conventional worldliness and distraction. We merely strive for pleasure and success and do our best to keep the reality of death out of view. The second strategy is the province of religion, which assures us that death is but a doorway to another world, and that the most important opportunities in life occur after the lifetime of the body. But there's another path, and it seems to be the only one compatible with intellectual honesty. That path is the subject of this book. Enlightenment. What is enlightenment, which is so often said to be the ultimate goal of meditation? There are many esoteric details that we can safely ignore, disagreements among contemplative traditions about what exactly is gained or lost at the end of the spiritual path. Many of these claims are preposterous. Within most schools of Buddhism, for instance, a Buddha, whether the historical Buddha Siddhartha Gautama or any other person who attains the state of, quote, full enlightenment, is generally described as omniscient. Just what this means is open to a fair bit of cavilling. But however narrowly defined, the claim is absurd. If the historical Buddha were omniscient, he would have been at minimum a better mathematician, physicist, biologist, and Jeopardy contestant than any person who has ever lived. Is it reasonable to expect that an ascetic in the 5th century BC, by virtue of his meditative insights, spontaneously became an unprecedented genius in every field of human inquiry, including those which did not exist at the time in which he lived? Would Siddhartha Gautama have awed Kurt Gödel, Alan Turing, John von Neumann, and Claude Shannon with his command of mathematical logic and information theory? Of course not. To think otherwise is pure religious piety. Any extension of the notion of omniscience to procedural knowledge, that is, knowing how to do something, would render the Buddha capable of painting the Sistine Chapel in the morning and demolishing Roger Federer at center court in the afternoon. Is there any reason to believe that Siddhartha Gautama or any other celebrated contemplative possessed such abilities by virtue of his spiritual practice? None whatsoever. Nevertheless, many Buddhists believe that Buddhas can do all these things and more. Again, this is religious dogmatism, not a rational approach to spiritual life. I make no claims in support of magic or miracles in this book. However, I can say that the true goal of meditation is more profound than most people realize, and it does in fact encompass many of the experiences that traditional mystics claim for themselves. It is quite possible to lose one's sense of being a separate self, and to experience a kind of boundless open awareness, to feel, in other words, at one with the cosmos. This says a lot about the possibilities of human consciousness, but it says nothing about the universe at large, and it sheds no light at all on the relationship between mind and matter. The fact that it is possible to love one's neighbor as oneself should be a great finding for the field of psychology, but it lends absolutely no credence to the claim that Jesus was the Son of God, or even that God exists. Nor does it suggest that the, quote, energy of love somehow pervades the cosmos. These are historical and metaphysical claims that personal experience cannot justify. However, a phenomenon like self-transcending love does entitle us to make claims about the human mind, and this particular experience is so well attested and so readily achieved by those who devote themselves to specific practices, the Buddhist technique of metta meditation, for instance, or who even take the right drug, MDMA, that there is very little controversy that it exists. Facts of this kind must now be understood in a rational context. The traditional goal of meditation is to arrive at a state of well-being that is imperturbable, or if perturbed, easily regained. The French monk Mathieu Ricard describes such happiness as, quote, a deep sense of flourishing that arises from an exceptionally healthy mind. The purpose of meditation is to recognize that you already have such a mind. That discovery, in turn, helps you to cease doing the things that produce needless confusion and suffering for yourself and others. Of course, most people never truly master the practice and don't reach a condition of imperturbable happiness. The near goal, therefore, is to have an increasingly healthy mind. That is, to be moving one's mind in the right direction. There is nothing novel about trying to become happy, and one can become happy within certain limits without any recourse to the practice of meditation. But conventional sources of happiness are unreliable, being dependent upon changing conditions. It is difficult to raise a happy family, to keep yourself and those you love healthy, to acquire wealth and find creative and fulfilling ways to enjoy it, to form deep friendships, to contribute to society in ways that are emotionally rewarding, to perfect a wide variety of artistic, athletic, and intellectual skills, and to keep the machinery of happiness running day after day. There's nothing wrong with being fulfilled in all these ways, except for the fact that if you pay close attention, you will see that there is still something wrong with it. These forms of happiness aren't good enough. Our feelings of fulfillment do not last, and the stress of life continues. So what would a spiritual master be master of? At a minimum, she will no longer suffer certain cognitive and emotional illusions. Above all, she will no longer feel identical to her thoughts. Once again, this is not to say that such a person will no longer think, but she will no longer succumb to the primary confusion that thoughts produce in most of us. She will no longer feel that there is an inner self who is a thinker of these thoughts. Such a person will naturally maintain an openness and serenity of mind that is available to most of us only for brief moments, even after years of practice. I remain agnostic as to whether anyone has achieved such a state permanently, but I know from direct experience that it is possible to be far more enlightened than I tend to be. The question of whether enlightenment is a permanent state need not detain us. The crucial point is that you can glimpse something about the nature of consciousness that will liberate you from suffering in the present. Even just recognizing the impermanence of your mental states, deeply, not merely as an idea, can transform your life. Every mental state you have ever had has arisen and then passed away. This is a first-person fact, but it is nonetheless a fact that any human being can readily confirm. We don't have to know any more about the brain or about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world to understand this truth about our own minds. The promise of spiritual life, indeed the very thing that makes it spiritual in the sense that I invoke throughout this book, is that there are truths about the mind that we are better off knowing. What we need to become happier and to make the world a better place is not more pious illusions, but a clearer understanding of the way things are. The moment we admit to the possibility of attaining contemplative insights and of training one's mind for that purpose, we must acknowledge that people naturally fall at different points on a continuum between ignorance and wisdom. Part of this range will be considered, quote, normal. But normal isn't necessarily a happy place to be. Just as a person's physical body and abilities can be refined, Olympic athletes are not normal. One's mental life can deepen and expand on the basis of talent and training. This is nearly self-evident, but it remains a controversial point. No one hesitates to admit the role of talent and training in the context of physical and intellectual pursuits. I have never met another person who denied that some of us are stronger, more athletic, or more learned than others. But many people find it difficult to acknowledge that a continuum of moral and spiritual wisdom exists, or that there might be better and worse ways to traverse it. Stages of spiritual development, therefore, appear unavoidable. Just as we must grow into adulthood physically, and we can fail to mature or become sick or injured along the way, our minds develop by degrees. One can't learn sophisticated skills such as syllogistic reasoning, algebra, or irony until one has acquired more basic skills. It seems to me that a healthy spiritual life can begin only once our physical, mental, social, and ethical lives have sufficiently matured. We must learn to use language before we can work with it creatively or understand its limits. And the conventional self must form before we can investigate it and understand that it is not what it appears to be. An ability to examine the contents of one's own consciousness clearly, dispassionately, and non-discursively, with sufficient attention to realize that no inner self exists, is a very sophisticated skill. And yet basic mindfulness can be practiced very early in life. Many people, including my wife, have successfully taught it to children as young as 6. At that age, and every age thereafter, it can be a powerful tool for self-regulation and self-awareness. Contemplatives have long understood that positive habits of mind are best viewed as skills that most of us learn imperfectly as we grow to adulthood. It is possible to become more focused, patient, and compassionate than one naturally tends to be, and there are many things to learn about how to be happy in this world. These are truths that Western psychological science has only recently begun to explore. Some people are content in the midst of deprivation and danger, while others are miserable despite having all the luck in the world. This is not to say that external circumstances do not matter, but it is your mind, rather than the circumstances themselves, that determines the quality of your life. Your mind is the basis of everything you experience and of every contribution you make to the lives of others. Given this fact, it makes sense to train it. Scientists and skeptics generally assume that the traditional claims of yogis and mystics must be exaggerated or simply delusional, and that the only rational purpose of meditation is limited to conventional, quote, stress reduction. Conversely, serious students of these practices often insist that even the most outlandish claims made by and about spiritual masters are true. I am attempting to lead you along a middle path between these extremes. one that preserves our scientific skepticism but acknowledges that it is possible to radically transform our minds. In one sense, the Buddhist concept of enlightenment really is just the epitome of stress reduction. And depending on how much stress one reduces, the results of one's practice can seem more or less profound. According to the Buddhist teachings, human beings have a distorted view of reality that leads them to suffer unnecessarily. We grasp at transitory pleasures. We brood about the past and worry about the future. We continually seek to prop up and defend an egoic self that doesn't exist. This is stressful, and spiritual life is a process of gradually unraveling our confusion and bringing this stress to an end. According to the Buddhist view, by seeing things as they are, we cease to suffer in the usual ways, and our minds can open to states of well-being that are intrinsic to the nature of consciousness. Of course, some people claim to love stress and appear eager to live by its logic. Some even derive pleasure from imposing stress on others. Genghis Khan is reported to have said, "The greatest happiness is to scatter your enemy and drive him before you, to see his cities reduced to ashes, to see those who love him shrouded in tears, and to gather to your bosom his wives and daughters." People attach many meanings to terms like happiness, and not all of them are compatible with one another. In the moral landscape, I argue that we tend to be unnecessarily confused about differences of opinion on the topic of human well-being. No doubt certain people can derive mental pleasure and even experience genuine ecstasy by behaving in ways that produce immense suffering for others. But we know that these states are anomalous, or at least not sustainable, because we depend upon one another for more or less everything. Whatever the associated pleasures, raping and pillaging can't be a stable strategy for finding happiness in this world. Given our social requirements, we know that the deepest and most durable forms of well-being must be compatible with an ethical concern for other people, even for complete strangers. Otherwise, violent conflict becomes inevitable. We also know that there are certain forms of happiness that are not available to a person, even if, like Genghis Khan, he finds himself on the winning side of every siege. Some pleasures are intrinsically ethical, feelings like love, gratitude, devotion, and compassion. To inhabit these states of mind is by definition to be brought into alignment with others. In my view, the realistic goal to be attained through spiritual practice is not some permanent state of enlightenment that admits of no further efforts, but a capacity to be free in this moment, in the midst of whatever is happening. If you can do that, you have already solved most of the problems you will encounter in life.